Okay, so here's a big thing that might be really obvious to a lot of people, but it took me a while to cotton onto this. So, standards. First of all, what are standards? Well, standards are, we have two kinds of standards, jazz standards and what you might call the American Songbook. And the American Songbook is a raft of tunes and songs, obviously, that are often played by jazz musicians, but are not exclusive to jazz musicians. So, obviously, popular singers like Frank Sinatra and so on sang them at the time, but they originally often come from shows or sometimes films. Sometimes released as individual sheet music way back in the hazy mists of time before recording, all sorts of things, right? So they're not actually jazz. They're just the raw material for jazz. And I also want to sort of talk a bit about the way that these popular songs, as they were known then, would have been learnt by jazz musicians back in the day. And there would have been two main sources. First of all would have been the sheet music, which would have been a written arrangement, probably in piano score, with vocals on top. Maybe some ukulele chords, which might be a bit inaccurate, over the top. Apparently most of the chord symbols you see in written sheet music at the time are actually ukulele chords, so that might explain why sometimes the roots, or rather the chords are in a funny position, they're not inverted or whatever, because you wouldn't need to worry about that on a ukulele. You wouldn't be able to do that stuff anyway. And obviously by ear. And the point I want to make is that, the first point I want to make is that this has changed over time. So you hit the 1970s, and then the first really good fake book being a compilation of jazz material written in lead sheet form, so with a melody with the chord symbols, accurate chord symbols over the top. This happened in the 1970s, and before that fake books have generally been, not great. And I mean, the real book itself has got quite a few mistakes in it, which kind of gives you an idea perhaps of how bad those original fake books were. And it was collated together by Berkeley students. So I would say that the real book for me represents the kind of the Bible, the holy scriptures of the Berkeley school of understanding jazz harmony and so on during the 70s. Well, we'll move on to that in a little bit anyway. But so the way that the tunes have been learnt now, and I think most people are now familiar with learning songs from a chart. Certainly in the early stages of jazz education. Later on, I think people start to learn them more by ear because that's what their teachers tell them to do. But in the early stages, you might be learning from charts. So that comes in at an early stage, and you'll be looking at tunes such as Stella by Starlight, All the Things You Are, Blue and Green, all this kind of stuff. So this sort of represents the jazz canon, some of which are American songbook songs, like Stella by Starlight, and some of which are jazz compositions, like Blue and Green. So it all gets munged up together, and you're perhaps not necessarily aware that some of these songs are compositions by jazz musicians, and some of them are by really Tin Pan Alley songwriters. At least I didn't when I was getting into jazz. I just thought this was all jazz material. But in fact, the history is more complicated than that. And obviously the boundaries of jazz are kind of vague anyway. To the extent that actually a lot of jazz musicians played in pit bands back in 20s, 30s and 40s. You hear stories about the show that Darn That Dream comes from. I can't remember the name of it, but apparently the pit band had people in it like Jack Teagarden, and Ethel Merman was one of the singers, So it's a collision between the show Broadway world and the jazz world, which continues to this day because many jazz musicians play in the pit orchestras for West End and Broadway shows. This is perfectly... this is a continuing tradition, I guess. Although more and more classical musicians are starting to go into the show bands, taking their jobs from the jazz musicians. But that's another story anyway. So we're looking at really a repertoire of popular song, and this, you would probably have learnt this from the radio. Maybe you would have found some sheet music just to maybe help you out with some of the chords, but. So this tradition is not of itself necessarily a jazz tradition, and many of the composers who wrote these Tin Pan Alley songs were classically trained. So what I'm getting at is that this idea of the real book kind of lead sheet is really very much jazz innovation. And by creating these arrangements, these lead sheet arrangements, they're not really arrangements, but You know what I mean by creating these lead sheet charts. You are changing the nature of the song, and I just want to explore in a little bit of detail how that happens and what that means. So we're going to start with a song that most jazz musicians know called Cherokee, which is by the composer Ray Noble. Now, Ray Noble is kind of involved in jazz because he was a writer and arranger, first of all, for Al Bowley, and then in the States, I think he had quite a lot to do with... he had his own orchestra in the States, and Charlie Barnett's orchestra recorded his song Cherokee, which became a big hit and influenced, obviously, Charlie Parker to learn the tune, and became one of his favourite blowing vehicles. Ray Noble is actually from Brighton, my hometown, and so there's a little bit of jazz history there, which surprised me, because I thought that Brighton didn't have anything to do with the history of music at all, although Roger Quilter lived there as well. So anyway... but Ray Noble himself was not a jazz-trained musician because there wasn't such a thing in those days. Jazz was something you learned on the bandstand and through the tradition, through the oral tradition and through apprenticeship. So he is a classically trained musician. He goes to the Royal College of Music, and the input he would have been getting there, I don't know who his teacher was, but it would have been very much, I would imagine, 19th century classical tradition stuff. So romantic harmony, Brahms, that kind of thing, right? The same tradition that people like Elgar and people like that came from, and that's kind of Victorian thing. I would think that would have been his upbringing. I might be wrong, but so let's take a look at Cherokee, and you'll notice right away. I mean, I really want to sort of start with the melody, and if I get a chart up for Cherokee, you don't have to read music to understand that. You're going to have to do this yourself because of copyright, etc., etc. But if I look at the lead sheet for Cherokee, we're just going to go to the A section, so just stop before it says B, and look at the notes. And you'll notice that there is, we're in the key of B flat, there is one sharp, one accidental on the first time bar, right? But everything else is within the key. Now, if you take a look at the chords, they look a little bit more complicated. We have B flat major, we have F minor 11th, B flat 13, E flat major 9th, A flat 7 sharp 11th. This version of the chart's got a G7 flat 9 in it and an F7 alt, but I would describe that probably originally would have been an F7 augmented chord, or an F augmented triad even. Would have been more stylistically of that time. So it doesn't really matter though, it's a different version of the changes. So the melody itself is actually based on mostly on the pentatonic scale, major pentatonic. Sorry, it's not that simple obviously because I can't play it right, but you get the idea. And that's the melody in Cherokee, and it's part of this whole kind of slightly racist 30s thing of writing kind of novelty dance hits based around something slightly exotic or unusual. So I'm thinking here of like things like China Boy, Limehouse Blues, Sheikh of Araby, and here we have Cherokee, which obviously got that kind of slightly Native American pentatonic vibe in it. So that's probably the first bit, and then he thought, what's some interesting changes I can run against it? And what I want to point out is that something really nice about Cherokee that you can actually use to help play it is that it has a lovely line cliche going all the way through it. So it goes B flat, first chord, and then it moves down to an A flat, and then it goes down chromatically, and then down to D, where it resolves onto the B flat chord. So if I play that against the melody, if I can do it, nice, isn't it? Sorry then. What would that be? Then. Yeah, it takes an extra bar to resolve there. Anyway, get the idea, so that's nice. So I think what Ray Noble did there is he thought, I've got this very, very straight, very uninteresting melody. What can I do to make it more interesting? And he wrote that chromatic line against it first. And then he filled in the rest of the changes around it. So it becomes B flat. that as a bass line, right? You know, it could be G flat major, sixth, or you know, A flat / G sharp or something there. Reminds me a little bit of how Jobim might write a tune, actually. Kind of like Jobim's bass lines always seem to be quite a big deal. He seems to think about those a lot. So that's a very different way of writing the chart. Now, the point is, as well, is that this is obviously classical practice. This is how a lot of these timpanelli songs are written. So I just wanted to also discuss the early jazz kind of practice. And the thing that I think is quite difficult for a lot of people who are trained, well, basically everybody who's trained in modern jazz theory, is to understand that there does seem to have been a separation between what the horns were allowed to do and what the chords were allowed to do. So I'll give you a really simple example, which is Honeysuckle Rose. Honeysuckle Rose is a melody that goes like this. Now, Honeysuckle Rose is a tune from the 1920s. I think it's 1928. Let's have a look. Let me just see if I can actually validate that with a bit of... 1929, in fact. So that is obviously before the bebop era and everything. Written by Fats Waller, of course. And the melody itself is kind of based on a sort of an octave displaced version of a B flat major 7th arpeggio. Now this relates really what we might call a flat 7 sub for a 2/5. The chords behind it are G minor, C7, C7, G minor. Okay, but we're playing this on the 9th, right? Really, I mean, but there's an 11th in there as well. So it's a very extended sound over that G minor or over that C7. You know, so we're actually playing the whole extended C13 harmony. But the chords on the guitar will always be G minor, C7, or maybe just C7 even. Why? Because it's not in the style to play these extended kind of, you know, kind of more modern jazz chords that we might play now. And this seems to be the case. I mean, if you go back far enough to the 1920s, you got things like Strokes and Barbecue, where the horn, you know, is playing a major 7th. You know. It's not really quite a melody, but anyway, you get the idea. So you got this idea that you actually got a lot of extensions and floating kind of stuff going on over the chords. I suppose because they're improvising and they're just playing the notes that sound good to them without any theoretical thoughts, over really these very simple banjo chords, you know, a lot of the time. Major and minor triads, dominant 7ths, diminished 7ths, but certainly nothing fancy, nothing like a, you know, one of these, for example. You know, you wouldn't hear that coming from a banjo in the 1920s, or even a piano player, I think. So in a way, if you look at it from a piano point of view, you had your left hand providing accompaniment and your right hand, yeah, I've got that right way around, playing melody. So the horns are like one hand and the chords are like the other. And that's quite counterintuitive because we're used to thinking of everything as being vertically unified now. But it does have a bearing for a song like Cherokee, which is that when we play it, Barry Harris kind of teaches this way. He separates improvisation and harmony out. They're separate classes. And he always says, like, over Cherokee, you know, you don't have to play the sharp 11th there if you don't want to. That's just in the melody. But if you're using the chords as the basis of improvisation, you can play it like that if you want. You can play the melodic minor if you want, the A flat Lydian dominant or E flat minor, whatever you want to think of it as. But that is not mandatory at all. So I kind of feel like these chords being kept very simple, and people have gone a little bit far with taking, or well, maybe far is the wrong word, but it's changed, hasn't it? It's a different idea now. So when you look at a chart for something like Cherokee, you're looking at all these extended changes, and they're right because they fit the melody. Those notes are in the melody, but it's not like the original composer thought of those as an upper structure or an extension to the chord necessarily. For example, in in Baroque harmony, you might have something like this. Let me see if I can actually do it right. So, you know, that's kind of thing, right? You know, so what I'm doing there is I'm kind of putting like little dissonances and suspensions and, you know, even appoggiaturas over the top of the basic harmony, which is, you know, you could write that down as a jazz extension. Like, for example, you could write this thing, we're in the key of A minor, and I play this thing here, and you could think of that as a major seventh chord, but it isn't. I mean, it's a 7 chord resolving to a 6. It has a very specific function. And then we moved back to that note, but then we resolve it, and then we set up another dissonance by moving into this, you know, what do you call that, 6/4/2 chord, you know, and so on. So the classical harmony operates in a different way, as it's the way you prepare and resolve dissonances, but you could misinterpret that and write that down as jazz extensions. And then if you did that, you would get more of this kind of, you know, and then, you know, maybe you play that as a dominant 7. And it starts to sound like jazz, because, you know, using the jazz notes, you know, that might become a... You might go, well, that's you know, that's an F major 7, so I'll play F major 7. And then I'll play like an altered... But already you can hear that sounds like, you know, modern jazz and not like classical harmony anymore. It's a different interpretation of the same basic information. It's not wrong, I don't want to say that it's wrong, but I would also say that earlier jazz practice kind of resembled the classical practice a little bit more, but obviously, as we've seen, people were quite free and easy with playing extensions over the chords. But the point I want to make is that that harmony is not baked in. So when you look at a standards chart, take a look at the melody. I've got another good example here that came up elsewhere on the forum, which is Blue and Green. Let me see if I can find that. Might have vanished. Now, Blue and Green is obviously a jazz original. It's written by Bill Evans. But the harmony functions, broadly speaking, in a similar sort of way. You have a really very simple melody written in, I mean, it's really D minor most of the way through. And then just towards the end, you have a C sharp, which is standard. That's a lower neighbour tone going into that D minor 7th arpeggio in bar 5. And then you've got a G sharp at the end, which is a very standard, you know, kind of alteration to a minor key, which implies a move to the dominant, and so on and so forth. So the melody is, you know, would have been completely understandable to somebody like Mozart. The chords that go along with it, and then, you know, yeah, boom, boom, and then you get this lovely E natural only against the B flat. That's right, I'm doing. And I mean, if you think of that A7 flat 9 as baked in, that, if you like, I mean, as a vertical chord structure, you will start to think of that as being a, you know, B flat altered, for example, which works perfectly well. Do that kind of thing. There's nothing wrong with that, you know, it sounds great. But the thing is that I don't think that's the way Bill Evans composed it. I just think he's thinking of a C note over that A7. That's a resolution that you hear a lot in Charlie Parker. You even hear it in Mozart and things like that, you know. Probably wouldn't be so bold about putting that cross relation there, but it does resolve. It's not itself necessarily part of that upper structure. You know, your mileage may vary. I mean, it's more likely that Bill Evans was thinking about upper structure than some of the Tim Panelli songwriters. But hopefully it gives you an idea that often the melody is very simple and just based around a diatonic scale, but the chords underneath appear to be more complicated because they are in reference to that diatonic scale. So, for example, you know, if I put an F note in the key of C, here's F, and then I say, well, you know, under that I'm going to put a... we're in C, right? So maybe I would use E7 to go to an A flat, you know, A minor. Can't even talk today. That gives you an A7 flat 9 right away. We haven't used the altered scale to get there or anything. It's just a diatonic note plus another chord very common as well when I go like D minor 11th and then going to G13. So these chords kind of fall out of the fact that there's a relationship between the melody, which is usually diatonic or heavily based on diatonic notes, and the chords, which are often more chromatic, or even if they're not, they can still look complicated. I mean, a classic example would be something like with I mean, this one is a good one, when you're in the key of C, say that'd be like a B flat 7 sharp 11th. But really, the melody note is just an E. So if I go, then if I do that chord, that's still a diatonic melody note, but I've put this kind of A flat diminished major, whatever that is, A flat diminished 13th. That's just an A flat diminished with a E on top, and actually it's not as chromatic a chord as you think. There's only one chromatic note in it, which is that, the A flat. The other notes, F, B and E, are all diatonic. So really what I've done is I've just taken, I'm really just taking the bass line, and that's chromatic. But because the chord is chromatic, everything goes like woo, and then you have this kind of complicated looking chord, which actually mostly belongs within the diatonic scale. So if I was improvising through that, again A minor, let's use the ordinary A minor chord, and then this weird A flat diminished thing, then go to C major. I could just go. So I'm just using the A flat there, because that's the characteristic note of the scale, of the chord, sorry. But I don't even have to do that. So my point is that extensions and writing the melody into the chords can make the chords and the harmony look much more complicated than it actually is, when in fact it's just relating to some basic diatonic thing, perhaps with some chromatic alterations. And our incorporation of that melody into upper structures in chords, upper structures, say in inverted commas, is entirely our own invention. And it's an invention of the post-Berkeley jazz theory, and has nothing to do with the way these songs are originally composed. It's fine. These sounds are good. I use them myself. They're part of the jazz heritage. But I think it's just worth considering that when you're learning a song and looking at the changes and looking at the melody. And looking at the melody is always the first step, in my opinion. Listening to the melody, it's particularly easy to see if you learn it by ear. So you go, oh, it's just like B flat, isn't it? Right? And then you think of the chords that are used to dress it up, and they might be based on some chromatic voice movement or something like that. And it just so happens that when you put those two things together, you come out with these fruity-looking extensions and complicated-looking chords that actually relate to something, two much simpler elements, which is usually a melody plus a melodic bass line. And really, as a jazz improviser, you have the option of soloing over the chords, which are usually based on the other voice movement, or you can base it on the melody, or you can skip between the two. But it's good to know, it's good to separate them out. And I think this is something that it took me a long time to learn, and I think people aren't always aware of. Anyway, I hope you find it useful and interesting. Comments below as always. Please subscribe if you're interested in this kind of material and rambling and so on. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.